Welcome to Standing Up. We're here with Gavriel Chichester. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, I don't know if you know this, but the other day there was this very inspiring rally in Tel Aviv. It was a protest in solidarity with the protesters in the United States. It was a great event, and at the end, I said I need to speak to the organizer and invite him on my podcast. And here you are. Welcome, Gavriel. It was an amazing event.
Thank
It
you for
really
having me.
was. Tell me, how did that idea come to you to put together that protest, and were you happy with the turnout?
It was honestly very last minute. A friend of mine sent me a screenshot of two young women who live here in Tel Aviv. One American Israeli, like myself, and one American who's working here in Israel, saying that they wanted to host some sort of demonstration in solidarity in front of the US Embassy in solidarity with the protesters and those who've been murdered by the police in the United States. And this was at the same time that I was thinking about doing something myself. And so I actually reached out to them. Mind you, this is all the day before. So I sent them both a message on Facebook, and we decided to work together in tandem. And it was very spur of the moment. At first we were planning to do it without a permit, and then we ended up getting a permit the same day. We had a feeling because of just how many people were asking us about it and how many messages we were getting, and my phone was blowing up and their phones were blowing up. We had a feeling it was going to be a really large group, but I'm very satisfied with the amount of people that came out. I was very nervous, not nervous, but I didn't know how many other Black faces I would see there. And so I was also quite pleased with that turnout as well. I'm happy to have that presence there. But I was glad that it was a mixed group of American Israelis, American Jews who are here in Israel, Israelis, native born, and a mix of Black people from different backgrounds. So I was really happy to see all of that.
I agree. I thought it was a very inspiring event, and it was a real pleasure being there. I read today that there have been protests in all 50 states and 17 countries. I'm not sure if they included Israel. I mean, they should have, because there was a protest here. So they say this makes it the largest protest, civil rights protest in history. It really unified the world. I mean, what happened to George Floyd was so brutal that I even saw people who generally would not speak out against police brutality. I've seen Trump supporters come out, and condemn what happened, which really gives me hope. But then, and on the other hand, I sometimes become demoralized because it seems like the attention has been hijacked by like the violence and the looting, and the violence seems to be the minority of people. It's just a small group of people. A lot of them, I think, are just opportunists. Either it's Antifa or the alt-right trying to start a race war, or it's just people who are, taking opportunity of turmoil to steal stuff, right? So it could be a whole different array of things. But, it kind of just got me thinking how easy it is for a small group of people to hijack something so legitimate and so beautiful. So on one hand, I'm hopeful by the size of this, but then I get demoralized when I see that. Are your thoughts similar?
I would say it's a complex question because I think in regards to what you were saying about Trump supporters who are like coming out and saying that what's happening is not right. I think in regards to that, that's great. And it's like, how is it possible that it's taking you that like this long to see that? And it makes me weary and suspicious of those motivations, I think. But in regards to violence and protests, I think that you're partially right in that it is most often peaceful protests. What we did here in Tel Aviv was a peaceful protest. We were very intentional about that. We took that very seriously. And I do think that most of these protests happening are peaceful. And you do have opportunists. You have random piles of bricks laying around by happenstance, you know, where people are protesting that are easy access. You have police officers themselves. There's been plenty of videos of police officers across the country breaking in windows, stealing things, vandalizing, framing it as the protesters. So you have all sorts of people. There's paid instigators, there's non-paid instigators. And some of the violence is coming from protesters themselves. Um, I'll say this. I understand why people are being more aggressive in these protests as opposed to protests of the past. Um, I don't care so much about like corporate buildings and things of this nature burning down because there's such a thing as business insurance. There is the point is that the capitalist structure of society on which we're built enables, you know, Black people to be oppressed in this way. These corporations that are not out here actively supporting the movement, not within their own corporations holding themselves accountable for creating inclusive and diverse work settings. You do, of course, have small businesses and things of that nature, unfortunately, being affected by the looting and by the violence, which I think is really sad. Unfortunately, I think that that should be reserved to corporate America and its representations. But I think what we're really seeing is a combination of all the things you mentioned before, all these different parties that are instigating, bringing out this fury of hundreds of years out of Black people. Right. And so when I look at the faces and the pictures and the videos of people throwing things and people being violent, it's very evident the pain in their eyes. Do I think violence is going to be the only effective way to get our point across? I don't think so. I think peaceful protest should be the main thing that people are trying to do, as well as organizing in their local communities. But I don't take well to folks criticizing the way Black people are choosing to mourn or to fight for themselves, because at this point it really does feel like a fight for our lives. I think we've seen peaceful protests happen, you know, in my generation, in my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, my great-grandparents' generation, and look, we're still here in 2020. And so I guess people are feeling like something needs to change.
Do you think the fact that people have been locked down for the past few months and there's even more, financial stress than normal, may have played into how people are reacting to this?
Absolutely. I think so. I think we're all frustrated. You know, it's interesting to see because obviously Black and Latinos were the most affected by COVID-19 in the United States, and obviously there's already poverty and devastation in those communities already, and so then when you have people losing jobs on top of it, obviously that can really up people's anxiety. It's interesting to see the people who are allies who are out there now who didn't have the same outrage about the fact that these communities were being disproportionately affected by coronavirus. But at the end of the day, I'm glad that folks are out there supporting. But I do think that everyone is very antsy. I think people have a lot of pent up energy. I think people are angry. I think people are confused and they feel like they're not being given information or like information is being withheld from them. And so I think all of those factors together, you're absolutely right, have added fuel to the fire.
Yeah, I could understand people making the claim that they think that the looting and the rioting is counterproductive. I'm not fully convinced. I think that some amount of, you know, um, turmoil gets people attention. I think perhaps it just needs to be the right amount. I do have a feeling, though, if it's too much riding, it has the ability to turn people off, people who otherwise, would be marching or allies. But again, I don't have a clear, you know, we only know so much how certain actions, what results they may have. But right now, I'm under the impression that we should strive to have it be as peaceful as possible. But that being said, we need to be able to understand, even if you don't agree that the rioting and the looting is productive, we should still understand where it comes from. And let's start with that. If you've been poor your whole entire life and you don't see much access to opportunity, and you have the ability to essentially steal from an insurance company, why wouldn't you, right? It's like, it makes so much sense. Um, if I was in a looter's shoe, I would be a looter myself. And rioting, I mean, this might sound weird, but the concept of running around breaking shit is appealing even when you're not angry. There's just something fun about it. So, like, I could see why people would take an opportunity where there's lawlessness to take to the streets and do that. I do think we should have a vibrant discussion, though, of like, you know, is it productive? Is it not productive? And I think the media is playing a big role in making it seem like it's worse than it is because, they have an agenda to get people glued to their TV, and you don't do that by showing peaceful protests. You get people glued to their TV by making it seem like the world is burning down, and I think,
Exactly.
yeah, they're responsible for a lot of this.
The unfortunate thing is, even though, like I said, the majority of protests happening, like the ones we did here, are peaceful, um, you still, and there's video evidence out there of peaceful protesters being attacked and brutalized by the police. Yes. For example, in my home city of Washington, D.C., there was a peaceful protest I've heard in front of the White House, like leading up to the White House. And as the president decided to emerge from his bunker, he wanted to give a speech in the Rose Garden. So you had, I believe it was National Guard there, basically tear gas and like flash bomb
Right.
this peaceful group of protesters back so that he could do a photo op, basically, and then walk 4 blocks down the street to go pose with a Bible in front of a church he's never been to.
With a Bible he's never read.
Right. So, and then there's many more examples like that. I've heard from friends about a protest in Detroit where there were police officers kneeling seemingly in solidarity, and the next thing you know, after the photo op is over, everyone got tear gassed. So there are peaceful protests that are going well. Like thankfully, our protest that we had here was peaceful, and we didn't have any problems. But there's a lot of peaceful protests going on that are running into issues.
It's wild that they're dealing with protests against police brutality with police brutality. Like they don't seem to understand what's happening.
I was talking to actually my younger cousin, who's also a black male. He lives in Philadelphia, which has really seen a lot of violence going on in the past couple of weeks. We were talking about the fact that there seems to be something that attracts certain type of people to the police force. And in a lot of these cases of brutality and murder, it seems almost like a flexing of power. If you look at who's in the police force, at least from like my experience in New York City, it's a lot of people from Staten Island, from Queens, a lot of white people from these areas who are kind of middle class, don't have so much economic power, maybe aren't accessing higher education all of the time. And for some people, this obviously isn't all police, but for some people, it's their way to gain access to power or to agency. And unfortunately, that doesn't always end so well. But if you look at the police force here in Israel, actually, uh, mostly comprised of Mizrahi folks, a group which is historically marginalized and socioeconomically disenfranchised uh, in Israel. And again, it's almost like people accessing power that they wouldn't otherwise have, and then taking with them all their biases, kind of projecting them, or or almost it's almost like getting back for like what you couldn't access in a way.
Right. I think this is also just an issue with power structures in general, that those who are most attracted to positions of power are the most likely to abuse power. So we have like an inherent issue with all these power structures because it's just not attracting the right people. I don't even have a good solution unless we like much more rigorous training, or even like being able to do some
Well, a
kind of
lot of people ask, like, what is it exactly that we're wanting and needing um, out of this protesting, and what is it that we've been asking for? Um, I touched on this a bit in the protests that we organized here in Tel Aviv. People are looking for things like tangible things like community oversight of the police, institutionalizing that in some way, that the people in the communities being policed actually have some sort of official stake and some sort of supervision and say in what is going on in policing in their neighborhoods, relying more on community policing as opposed to force, reducing the force, disarming a lot of the force. The entire police force doesn't need to be armed. Like, I just
and definitely not militarized.
Right, definitely not militarized. That's a big problem I have with the police here. The police here, we first of all, we have a military police. Like we have a border guard here. We don't need the normal police to also be militarized. But and also in addition, centralized database of every instance of excessive use of force, murder, abuse of power, in a way that's easily accessible when police are doing these things. And most of all, we need these cops who are committing these offenses to be charged and then convicted. It's insane to me that George Floyd's murderer, he's been charged with second degree murder, and it was originally third degree murder. And I just don't see how it's not first degree murder. But again, we need a system that is going to actually hold police accountable.
Right. I think for the record, first degree murder needs to be premeditated, so there needs to be like some evidence that he planned it, and it seems, I'm not sure if that evidence exists, but what happened was brutal as it gets. So I guess even if it doesn't classify as first degree murder, it should still be viewed as it is, as like a slow and painful death that this person of authority, imposed on another individual. I mean, it's sickening.
I really just hope that he's actually convicted of the crime because you know, if he's not, if we think like what's happening now is crazy, like if if he's not convicted, I can't even imagine what that would be.
I agree. I agree. If I were to guess, I would say he's going to be convicted, but he's not going to get a sentence that people are pleased with. That's just the feeling I have. Are you familiar with Campaign Zero?
I've heard of it a couple of times.
Yeah, so that's a platform. It's like a policy position for ending police brutality, and they have like they list 7 different things that what we can do to end police brutality. It's a great policy position. I'm gonna link it in the comments. Um, I almost feel like we're almost missing an opportunity that we're not hearing more about Campaign Zero, because in activism, I feel like it's easier to succeed in the goals if we set like a goal of legislation and we all unify around that piece of legislation. And I have been seeing a fair amount about Campaign Zero, but the majority of the noise doesn't mention it. Now, I get that there's a trade-off, because police brutality is not the only thing we want to talk about, right? There's institutional racism, there's subconscious biases that we all have, and I think this is not even a change in legislation. This is more a cultural change. Um, yeah, how do you think we find the balance between like what to push, because there's really a lot we need to work on, and I almost feel like when we work on everything at once, we're we accomplish less.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because we were thinking about how do we forward the conversation that we've started here in Israel. Um, and hopefully soon, um, hopefully by the end of this month, we want to set up a sort of town hall with different organizations and different community leaders so that people are able to make connections with people that they can actually do something with here on the ground. And I think to answer your question, the way that you keep people motivated and the way you can sort of put more energy into pushing policy and not getting distracted by throwing your energy in too many directions. I think people um, need to be connected to tangible things that they can do in their own communities. Whether that's about this bail fund in your particular neighborhood or community or borough, and you volunteer with them and you push those agendas, or you decide to work with some sort of social organization that works on people challenging their own personal biases and things of that nature. I think if people are able to find something that they can put their volunteer power behind or their professional power behind, that's specific, acknowledging that all these other factors are also important, but if people can really find something they connect to and focus on that specific thing, all of these things together, as they come together, they change the bigger picture. If that makes
Yep.
sense.
Yep. I, I'd like to stay on the topic of these biases or prejudices because I think this is the one of the hardest things to change because, as we mentioned, it's not policy, it's introspection, and it's self work. It's something I've been doing for years now, and I still have tremendous work to do. I always notice my biases, and I'm constantly working on them. Um, and yet, so much more work to be done. Um, I hear a narrative that I can't say I'm on board with, and it's the narrative that all white people are racist. I have a feeling that what they're getting at is that all white people have some kind of prejudice towards people who don't look like them. Would you say that's the claim?
Yes, I think when people are saying all white people are racist, I think what they're trying to say is that all white people, and it's really not even just all white people, all people have internal biases
Right,
that they've grown up with.
right,
Um, and or have learned along the way or have had experiences that have shaped the way that they view certain groups of people. Um, and because we're all products of our society, it's inevitable that those biases will manifest somehow, whether it's done consciously or unconsciously. And so I
right.
think really when you're hearing people say, "Oh, white people are racist," it's a reaction to those white people who are saying, "Well, I'm like," who get have this very visceral reaction to being called a racist, which like I could understand,
Yeah,
but it's almost like saying just because you're not consciously racist doesn't mean that you're incapable of
right,
racism.
right,
um, I think is a better way of phrasing it. And just because you're not consciously racist doesn't mean that there aren't moments when you're acting on an implicit bias that you didn't even know you had. Um, I've had the same sort of conversations around anti-Semitism with people, even minorities who maybe have some unconscious biases that they didn't even realize they had or that they're manifesting, even though they're not making that conscious effort. Things that they've learned have come up out of them without them
yeah,
even realizing it. And I think that's what people are really getting at. Everyone has these internal biases,
yeah,
and we all need to be working to overcome them. Even I sometimes realize, like, as a product of the society I grew up in, um, I even have to catch myself sometimes when I'm having internal biases based on internalized racism. You know, um, things that I've been taught about Black people and how we are, things that I've been taught about other Black people based on the tone of their skin, or the tone of their Blackness. and challenging myself on those, and overcoming those. So I think that's a project for all of us to be doing all the time.
I'm very happy that you presented it that way because I think that, the way we present concepts and ideas need to be in a way that are palatable to a wider audience. They need to be scalable. When someone says all white people are racist, you'll have a small fraction of white people who may accept that premise, but the vast majority won't. They don't want to be put in the same category as the KKK or Nazis. But if we say, you might not be racist, but you have these unconscious biases, and this affects how you view people and the decisions you make, and collectively this affects society. I think that is a narrative that can scale very well. I think we could get people on all sides of the political spectrum to agree on. And it's also, as you mentioned, it's not work only for white people. It's just work for people. The less biases we have, the less prejudice we are, the better off we are as a species. So I really prefer this framing, and I'm glad you agree. I have a feeling the majority are with us on this. It's hard to tell from social media because it's like you don't know if the loudest voices, if they're the majority or if they're just the loudest, right? So you see certain narratives.
Sure. And I think also kind of what you're seeing is people people meant that, and then but out of anger, which is justified anger, it comes out in a less eloquent way. So I'm always careful about. I really do think this is a conversation to have internally in the Black community that I don't talk about so much outside of the Black community. There's a way to like acknowledge the validity of our anger and our trauma, and then again, this is more aimed at Black people, and like not really open for comment outside of
For
that.
sure.
But there comes a time for us to confront that trauma and like think about how we're going about things in a smart way. If that
Yeah, yeah. And look, I'm fully on board with that. There's certain conversations that I will have just to Jews about, things within the Jewish
absolutely
community.
same
Yeah,
thing,
there's just some conversations that aren't for everybody, and
right?
people need to
Yeah,
accept that. So I'm fully on board with that. I guess since we're on the topic of narratives, that how to build better narratives that scale. There's
hmm
another one that I struggle with. And someone can make the case that I struggle because of my own biases. I'm open to that claim, right? I'm open to exploring that, but it's the concept that you can't be racist towards white people. Have you heard that one? That that
hmm
it's and in order for that to be true, so that the definition of racism needs to change to involve institutional racism, but I think that's just really confusing. I think most people accept racism as viewing one race as superior or inferior to another, and then institutional racism is that concept within institutions. But I feel like people are like combining those two terms into one, and again, it's one of these ideologies that some people accept, but most people, and even when I say most people, I mean most liberals are like, I don't know about that. Doesn't seem like that makes sense.
hmm I think, if I'm being honest, I think that's also a conversation that like I've had difficulty with. I think that a lot of times when white people do say that, a Black person or someone's being racist toward them, I think a large portion of those are false cries. But then some of it is based in truth. Yeah, it's a hard it's a hard conversation. I do think, yeah, I think that we've kind of combined the definition of racism and the definition of institutionalized racism together, and specifically in a way that it works in an American, like United States context, because racism in the United States doesn't exactly look like racism in a different country, for example, because there's different structures at play, there's different groups at play. And yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think when people are reinforcing that idea that like there needs to be some sort of structural imbalance of power, what they're getting at is like me making an assumption or asserting a stereotype about white people doesn't have the same power or power over you than asserting or promoting some
Right.
sort of narrative of a group that is structurally oppressed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Race, like when a white person is experiencing prejudice or racism, whatever you want to call it, from a minority, it's limited to social prejudice or social discrimination, as opposed to when a white person says something to a black person. It could be social on a superficial level, but then there's a whole structure and series of institutions to back that person up. Um, you know, I don't think that gives anyone license to like disrespect people though.
I guess that's one concern. It's like the second, it almost like takes away accountability if you just can't be racist, because it's not systemic. It's like then you can do whatever you want, and maybe that's not the result, but it just seems, yeah,
I agree with you.
yeah. I think we just need a more nuanced conversation, like, so there's racism, and we could even just use the traditional definition. Then there's systemic racism, that's, systems and institutions that are racist. And then we could also talk about the concept that you just spoke about, that being racist, if you are in a position of power, has a greater effect than if you are not in a position of power. So that's kind of like, and then there's the concept of unconscious bias or prejudice. So I think we need to clearly define these terms and use them correctly, because I think it's really a best way to spread this narrative, and really accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. I hang out meaning like on social media. Like I'm in all sorts of yeah, I don't actually hang out with these people, but I'm in all sorts of social media groups of people who have quite horrible views. They're either racist, anti-Semites, Holocaust deniers. I mean, the whole spectrum. And even all the way to like black supremacists. I'm in some communities like that as well. And I do that just so I could learn about people and how they think and what they think of others' narratives. And it really teaches me, just more about people and just helps me have better and more productive conversations. So, the right and some on the left, and I don't really like this left-right paradigm because it just doesn't mean much. It's really, it's like it only could explain so much about who you are, what side of the political spectrum you fall on. But a lot a lot of people just don't fully understand what the black rights movement is about today. They just don't get it. Now, part of them, I guess they don't get it because they don't care to get it, right? It's just an uncomfortable truth for them to come to terms with. But I also have a feeling, and I kind of feel weird. I feel like I'm just like this white guy criticizing like a black rights movement. That's not my intention at all. I'm just trying to, do what I can to contribute ideas that help. But I feel like we could potentially do better, all of us, in our messaging, how we convey the message, how we have these conversations, how we build alliances.
Yeah, I think, like I said, there's a lot of anger and a lot of emotion and a lot of trauma that fuels these conversations, and not even just from the side of oppressed minorities, specifically Black people, but also from people like in the far right, the reactionaries, who were basically economically abandoned by the United States government, and like nothing was ever fixed, and they feel like something has been stolen from them that they had no hope getting back. And unfortunately, a lot of them have bought into the narrative that it's oppressed peoples in this country that stole it from them, even though that's not the case. It's a
Yeah, they blame Mexicans. They blame Mexicans instead of corporate America.
right, and really, it's technological automation,
Yeah, more than
and
anything. Yeah.
among other things. But again, narrative building has a lot of power. I think the way that you address that and the way that you get people to hear each other better is restorative justice. an example of restorative justice is like what you saw um, in South Africa post-apartheid, people being given an institutionalized space to hold people accountable for crimes that they've committed, yes, but also bring with them the emotions and have an institutionalized space for healing to happen as well and for understanding to happen, because we can try to sanitize these issues into being purely political or talk about them purely from a theoretical standpoint, or purely from a policy standpoint, but nothing will ever happen if you ignore the fact that all of this is based in emotion, because when you're rejecting someone's humanity on a very basic level and putting that into policy, of course, that comes with trauma there. And if there's no healing there, you're still going to get people lashing out in ways that are less productive. You're still going to get people being angry on the internet. You're still going to get people throwing bricks because they've been given no other way to heal what's broken. And I think that healing is generational, but I think that there needs to be some sort of restorative justice that happens.
Right. Much of what's going on do you think is race related, and how much do you think is really socioeconomics that just boil over into other things? Because you mentioned there's a lot of white people who Trump got elected because a lot of white people feel like they got abandoned, right? So then they go to white nationalism or whatever. But I feel like a lot of the tension starts from being poor, and then it's easier to you ascribe to a different movement or ideology that you can then be politicized for political gain, essentially. Or is it just hard to differentiate between what's what?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to differentiate, especially at this point, because institutionalized racism is so old and so intertwined with socioeconomic power in the United States, particularly. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of look back and see the ancestors of each of these groups in America, right? When you talk about Black people, slaves, when you talk about like sort of middle American, middle to lower middle class white folk, you talk about like indentured servants, like white sharecroppers, that sort of thing. And then you have the elite, obviously people who are owning slaves, running corporations, industries, things of that nature. And so those are very old social structures, and those, like the remnants of them, still exist today in the United States. And it's a really blurry line. It's a really blurry line because someone might be genuinely frustrated because they're poor, and sure, white nationalism might appeal to them because it has this promise of restoring economic opportunity to white people. But they also, like a part of them also has to believe that people who are not white are lesser than them in order to buy fully into that ideology. So I do think that it is mixed, and it's kind of, especially at this point, hard to separate them.
Yeah. What is I guess I want to touch briefly on like what institutional racism actually looks like. Like what is a racist institution? To mind is I think, let's say, the police and the courtroom, for example. If you have the majority of police officers and judges and juries being of a different community, of a different skin color than the people who they are watching over or prosecuting, again, that prejudice is going to create a disparity with how black people are treated under the law and how they're treated by police compared to white people. Is that really what an institutional, is that essentially what institutional racism is, or is there something more that I'm not getting at?
That's one instance. When we talk about institutional racism, it also involves the legacies of certain policies. For example, my cousin worked once upon a time as a civil rights attorney in Baltimore City, specifically working with housing discrimination. Now, why does housing discrimination exist the way today that it still does in Baltimore? It's a legacy of redlining. And if you don't know what redlining is, um, It was a system of, after folks returned from the war, and the GI Bill was a thing helping to get veterans homes. Um, Cities and property, like real estate agencies, would sort of draw these red lines and kind of block off white communities and refuse to sell Black folks homes and things of this nature. And you see the remnants of those red lines in the what appear to be self-segregation uh, borders within cities today. So it's another example of institutionalized racism. Institutionalized racism also looks like telling people that they can't wear an afro or braids to school. Institutionalized racism has so many forms and is so insidious and affects us at every level of society, um, that yes, the courts are a place where it exists, but we have to understand that the weight of it is so heavy because it exists in every part of our lives.
Right. I would say two more examples of institutional racism would be the media and how they depict black people compared to white people. You'll see, they often are showing a black person wearing a hoodie, even if they're a victim, right? It's like that person could be killed and they'd be depicted in a hoodie, and then a white person, they're going to get their like school picture, right? So this, again, this just feeds into our already existing biases. And another one I would say is Hollywood, because Hollywood's depiction of black people is normally like gangs and stuff like that, and it's just like a certain type, and again, that reinforces our biases. So that's a few more areas to look at. um, I guess final question, it's a personal one. You've lived both in Israel and America,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Has your experience as a black man been different in these two countries, and if so, how?
yeah, sure. Um, it has definitely been different. I think I'm always aware of the fact that I'm Black, obviously, but I would say I feel more acutely aware of my Blackness in the United States. And that's because here I have this additional layer of being Jewish that gives me institutional privilege here, right? And so I guess the best way to explain what I'm meaning is I can tell a story about one time I got on a bus and I didn't know that my Ravka, which is the thing we used to pay for buses here in Israel, I didn't know that like it didn't have money on it. I was just on my way home. Didn't know that I needed to recharge it. I tapped it. I got a red light, and the bus driver, he like I always wear my necklace, which has Miguel David on it, and it's pretty visible. So, he just let me, whatever. Also, I should add that my complexion is fair. I'm light skinned. I'm a significant percentage English and Irish heritage, around 35% actually. So um, colorism also is a factor here. Like I even have Israelis ask me sometimes, but like you're not really Black. I'm like, but I am. uh, because again, the
That's
perception of what is Black is different
yeah,
in
that's a
different
typical
places.
Israeli question too. Like
It
Israelis
is.
would ask that question, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, the story, he lets me go, and then two Sudanese men get on the bus right behind me. There's a large population of Sudanese refugees and asylum seekers in Tel Aviv, and one of them pays, the other one doesn't have any money on his Rav card either. And the bus driver, who was a Russian Jew, created this whole big balagan, this whole big problem about it. And so I do see like where my privilege as like a Jewish citizen here um, affords me certain protections and rights and even social acceptance where other Black people who are living in Israel who aren't necessarily Jewish don't have that same protection. I would say also people, like I said earlier, people perceive my race differently here. In the United States, people are like, of course you're Black, what do you mean? Um, they might, assume or ask if I'm mixed or not, but like they see me as black generally. And no one would really question me if I said I was black in the United States. Here, I'm challenged on my race more. More so people tell me I'm not black or that, um, you know, and I think that's just, again, like the culture and where you are and the context really shapes how people perceive race. Um, because in a country full of black people, people perceive race differently. In a country full of white people, people perceive race and ethnicity differently. So that's always interesting to see.
Yeah.
Um,
Thanks for sharing that perspective. I actually never thought of it in those terms. It's very interesting. Be- before we before we wrap it up, is there anything else you'd like to say? Maybe you could plug something you're working on. Maybe a way people could find out more about you and what you're doing, or a different organization.
um, So, like I said, and we're not an official organization by any means, but the same folks that I organized the protests this past week in front of the embassy with, we are in the process of working again on some sort of town hall forum sort of thing to happen by the end of the month. Again, bringing together community organizations that are doing work on the ground in a number of different types of marginalized communities here in Israel. So we're focusing our focus more to what's going on at home. They're still along the lines of racial injustice and police brutality. But our main goal there is to really connect people again to things that they can throw themselves into and make a really tangible change. That's all I would say.
Gavriel, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for standing up for such an important cause. And I'd love to help you, in whichever way possible. So I'm sure we'll stay in touch and find ways to work together.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.